Hey besties, welcome back to Maggie Stories. What would you do if your husband faked being paralyzed and you had to watch his closest friend celebrate his fall with a straight face?
The flowers arrived before the news did. 37 white chrysanthemums, Korea's flower of death, delivered to the front gate of the Han River penthouse at 6:14 in the morning. With no card, no sender, and no apology. The housekeeper nearly screamed. Julia Baptiste Kwan stood in the marble foyer in a silk robe the color of deep plum, bare feet on cold floor, and looked at those flowers for a long, long time. She didn't cry. She didn't call her husband. She called his mother. Yamianim, she said when Madame Kwan picked up on the second ring, because Madame Kwan always picked up on the second ring, even at 6 in the morning, even in her sleep. Someone sent chrysanthemums. A pause. Then, how many? 37. Another pause, longer this time. Then the sound of silk rustling, slippers on hardwood, a door closing softly. When Madame Kwan spoke again, her voice had dropped an octave. Don't touch them. Don't move them. And don't let Sikjin see them when he comes home. He's not home yet. The silence that followed that sentence had texture. Wait, the kind of silence that meant both women were thinking the same thing and neither wanted to say it out loud. Come to me, Madame Kwan said finally. Bring your overnight bag. Julia hung up the phone, looked at the flowers one more time, and felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. Like her body already knew something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She'd been in Seoul for 6 years. She'd been Kwon Sikjin's wife for 4. And in those 4 years she had learned, slowly, carefully, the way you learn a language you were never supposed to speak. That peace in this world was always borrowed. It was always someone else's emergency waiting to become yours. She went upstairs, packed her bag, put on a camel-colored cashmere set, wide-leg trousers, and ankle boots with a heel that clicked authority into every floor she walked across. Gold hoops, a delicate chain. The watch Sikjin had given her in Jeju on their 2nd anniversary. The one he'd had engraved on the back with coordinates that meant the place I first knew I was done for. She looked at herself in the mirror, touched the watch, and took one breath. Then she left the chrysanthemums on the doorstep and walked out like a woman who had somewhere important to be. She'd met Kwon Sikjin the way most important things happen. Sideways when she wasn't looking, in a situation she hadn't planned. She'd been 26, freshly landed in Seoul from Port of Spain by way of a business degree and an appetite for something bigger than the island could hold. Not running from Trinidad. She loved home the way you love your mother, complicated and complete, but running towards something she couldn't name yet. She'd gotten a consultant position at a nightlife development firm, the kind of job that meant she spent her evenings in clubs taking notes and her mornings in boardrooms translating what she'd seen into strategy. She was good at it. Annoyingly good. She had a way of reading a room, any room, that felt less like skill and more like a second sense she'd been born with. She'd been at a soft launch in Gangnam, standing near the bar with a glass of sparkling water and a clipboard she wasn't actually using, when the energy in the room changed. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in films, with music swelling and people parting like the Red Sea. It was subtler than that. It was the way conversations shortened, the way eyes moved, the way the room seemed to exhale and then hold its breath. She turned around, and there he was. Kwon Sikjin at 31 was not the kind of man you described easily. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that meant his suits had to be made for him, not found. Dark eyes, very direct, the kind that made you feel like being seen was a privilege he was choosing to extend. He moved through the room like he'd built it. Not arrogance. He wasn't loud about it. Just certainty. The deep, settled kind. He'd looked at her from across the room and she'd looked back. Because she was Julia Baptiste from San Fernando and she had never, not once in her life, been the first to look away. He'd smiled. She'd thought, oh, this is going to be a problem. 3 weeks later she was his. 3 years after that she was his wife. A year after that she was sitting across from Madame Kwan in a tea room in Hanamdong learning that the man she'd married existed in a world that didn't follow ordinary rules. And that if she wanted to stand beside him in it, she would have to grow teeth she didn't know she had. She'd grown them, gladly. The accident happened on a Thursday. Or rather, the news of the accident happened on a Thursday. The call came to her personal phone at 11:17 p.m. from a number she didn't recognize. She was at their second property, a converted hanok in Buckshin. reviewing the liquor licensing for the new club in Itaewon. Her business, entirely her own, structured beneath an LLC that Seekjin had helped her build but never touched, was 3 venues deep now with a 4th coming. She was good at it. She had an eye for atmosphere, for talent, for the particular alchemy that made a room magnetic. She'd built something real. The voice on the phone was professional. Clipped. A hospital administrator, it seemed, though she noted later that the call had lasted exactly 41 seconds. Mrs. Kwan, your husband has been in a serious accident on Gangbuk Expressway. He's been transported to. She didn't panic. She noted, clinically, that her hands were steady as she wrote down the hospital name. She noted that her voice, when she asked which ward, came out level. She noted that she thanked the caller, hung up, and sat completely still for 30 seconds before she moved. Then she called Madame Kwan again, because that was the protocol they'd built together, the two of them, quietly over years of small meals and long conversations and a kind of mutual respect that had grown into something closer to devotion. If something happens, you call me first, before the press, before the lieutenants, before anyone. I know, Madame Kwan said when she picked up. Come. The hospital room was quiet. Seekjin lay in the bed looking, and this was the part that cracked something open in Jalia's chest. The part she hadn't been prepared for. Genuinely diminished. He was good at it. Breathtakingly good. The tubes, the monitors, the still weight of him beneath the sheets. His father sat in the corner chair, face carved into grief, and didn't look up when she entered. His mother stood at the window with her hands folded, and when Jalia came to stand beside her, she put one hand on Jalia's arm and squeezed once. Hard, grounding, real, and that was all. The doctors spoke. Spinal contusion. Significant. Uncertain prognosis. Rehabilitation. Time. Jalia nodded, asked careful questions, held Seekjin's hand, which was warm and alive and entirely healthy, but could not squeeze back because that was the story they were telling. She kissed his forehead. She sat beside him for 2 hours. And the whole time, somewhere beneath the performance of her grief, because she was performing, she didn't fully understand the plan yet, but she understood that it was a plan and that her role was to believe in it absolutely. She was thinking. She was cataloging. She was remembering. 3 weeks before the accident, she'd been in Seekjin's study late at night, jet-lagged from a supplier trip to Japan, unable to sleep. He'd left his laptop open. She hadn't meant to look, except that she had, because she was Jalia Baptiste Kwan, and looking was her greatest skill. What she'd seen on that screen had taken her a full week to fully process. Financial transfers she didn't recognize. Names she did. A group chat. 4 of them. Men she'd shared dinner tables with, men she'd poured drinks for, men who had called her Uni in the fond, familiar way. Full of things that turned her stomach and then turned it again into ice. She hadn't confronted Seekjin immediately. She'd sat with it, moved through their house differently, more quietly, started paying attention in new ways. And it was during this period, maybe 10 days in, that she'd been sitting in the kitchen at midnight with a cup of bush tea her mother had sent from home, half dozing over a contract, when she'd heard Seekjin's voice from his office. Low, measured, speaking in a register she recognized as his serious register. Not the voice he used for boardrooms or social dinners, but the one that meant the conversation was load-bearing. She drifted closer. Not deliberately, she'd tell herself later, though she knew that wasn't true, and stood in the hallway and listened. And she understood Korean. Had for 2 years now. She'd learned it quietly, privately, with a tutor she'd never mentioned to anyone in their circle, because she was a woman who believed in information asymmetry the way other women believed in skincare, religiously and with long-term results in mind. She heard everything, and what she heard made everything she'd seen on that laptop cohere into a single, terrible, elegant picture. She went back to the kitchen, finished her tea, went to bed, and in the morning, over breakfast, she'd looked at her husband across the table. Handsome, careful, complicated man, and said, very quietly, Seekjin, I think you should tell me what's actually happening. He'd gone still in the way men go still when they realize, with a sensation somewhere between relief and terror, that the person sitting across from them is not who they'd thought, that they are, in fact, more. How long have you spoken Korean? He asked. Long enough, she said, and poured him more coffee. They talked until 3 in the morning. She told him everything she knew. He'd told her everything she didn't. And by the time dawn started coming through the windows, gray and quiet over the river, they had the bones of something. We give them what they want, he said. We let them think they've won. And then, she said. And Seekjin had looked at her, the way he'd looked at her in that club in Gangnam 7 years ago, the way that said you are a problem I chose and I would choose again, and smiled. By Friday morning, the news had spread the way bad news always does in worlds built on power. Fast, and with pleasure barely concealed beneath the performance of concern. Kwon Seekjin paralyzed. Kwon Seekjin incapacitated. Kwon Seekjin finished. She saw it in the messages that came to her phone. 53 of them in the first 12 hours, all some variation of "we're so sorry. Please let us know if there's anything we can do," the kind of sympathy that tastes like appetizers before a feast the sender has already planned. She saw it in the flowers, not chrysanthemums this time, because now the death they were celebrating was social, not literal. Enormous ostentatious arrangements delivered to the hospital from men who had sat at her dining table 6 weeks ago and laughed at her husband's jokes. She responded to every single message. Warmly, promptly, in perfect, native-level Korean. She was gracious. She was soft-voiced. She was the picture of a devoted wife bravely holding it together. And she noted every name. By Sunday, the board had voted. Efficiently. She had to admit, they'd moved fast. To restructure Seekjin's holdings under a temporary directorial committee. A polite word for "we're taking what's his while he can't stop us." She'd gotten the legal documents forwarded to her by Seekjin's actual attorney. Not the firm the board used, his personal one. A woman named Kim Boyeon who was brilliant and loyal and had been told everything. And she'd sat with them on the bedroom floor of Madame Kwon's house, cross-legged in cream loungewear, reading every clause while Madame Kwon brought her barley tea and sat beside her in silence. "They moved faster than we expected," Julia said. "Hyenas," Madame Kwon said simply. "They were hungry before he fell." Julia looked up at her. At this woman, elegant, compact, with Seekjin's eyes and a spine like architecture, who had never once, in 4 years, made her feel like an outsider in this family, who had taken her shopping for Chuseok the first year. Not because it was expected but because she'd wanted to, who had sat with her through a miscarriage 2 years ago and held her hand and said nothing for an hour, which was exactly the right thing, who had, when the news of the accident broke, not crumbled but organized. "They don't know I can see all of it," Julia said. Madame Kwon nodded once. "That is the point." On Monday she went to the hospital in a chocolate brown wool coat with a wide lapel and structured shoulders, tailored cigarette trousers in cream, and low-heeled boots. A silk scarf at her neck, rust and gold Hermes, the one she'd bought herself after closing the Itaewon licensing deal. Her hair was pulled back, smooth, with a few pieces loose around her face. Understated, controlled. The look of a woman who had slept when she hadn't and eaten when she'd barely managed tea. She pushed the wheelchair herself. They went to the garden. It was cold. November in Seoul is a serious kind of cold. Not the wet gray cold of rainy season but dry and clean and cutting. She'd brought a blanket for his lap and her own coat was buttoned to the throat and she walked slowly, wheels on the path, and didn't say anything for a while. "Someone photographed us yesterday," Seekjin said quietly. His voice was normal, low and warm and completely his, because they were alone here. "I know," she said. "I saw the account. Some gossip blog. They used the word tragic." One of the comments said I was performing. Her voice was entirely neutral. "That no wife is that devoted." He turned his head slightly, which was the only way he could look at her from the chair. "What did you think when you read that?" "I thought," she said, steering them around a low hedge, "that people who have never been loved properly cannot recognize love when they see it." A pause. The bare branches of a ginkgo tree overhead. Pigeons somewhere. "Julia, don't," she said quietly. "Don't thank me. Don't do that." "I wasn't going to thank you." "What were you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then, tell you that I'm sorry. That I've been running so long in a world full of people who wanted something from me that I forgot. I actually forgot, for a minute, what it felt like to have someone who didn't." She stopped pushing, stood behind him, put her hands on his shoulders, just rested them there, the weight of her palms, the warmth. "You didn't forget," she said. "You just got confused. Those aren't the same thing." Above them, the last gold leaves of the ginkgo tree let go, one by one, drifting down through cold air, going nowhere in particular and getting there peacefully. She started walking again. The gossip blog was called Soul Whispers and it had 2.3 million followers. Jalea found it at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the performance, sitting cross-legged on the bed in the Buckshin hammock with a glass of red wine and her laptop open. The post had been up for 6 hours. It had 14,000 likes. The title, in bold Hangul that she read without effort, said, Kwan Empire Crumbles. Wife stages sympathy tour. There was a photo, taken from a distance, clearly through a zoom lens, the composition slightly tilted the way photos taken in a hurry always are. Her, in the hospital garden, pushing the wheelchair. The angle had been chosen deliberately. She could see that immediately, with the eye of someone who had spent years staging atmospheres for a living, to make her look performative. The scarf at her neck caught too much light. Her expression, frozen mid-sentence, read as something other than what it was. She stared at it for a long time. Then she screenshotted it, sent it to Seekjin's personal phone with the caption they used the worst angle and put her laptop down. He replied in 4 seconds, You still look incredible. She replied, That's not the point. He replied, I know. But it's still true. She put the phone face down and lay back on the pillow and looked at the ceiling of the hammock. Old dark timber, the particular quiet of a building that had stood through several centuries of other people's dramas, and thought about what she was going to do about Soul Whispers. She decided by morning. The account posted again on Thursday. This time it was a clip. Someone had filmed her from across the street as she left the hospital, walking to the car. 10 seconds of footage, her in a long charcoal coat and wide-leg trousers, sunglasses on, driver holding the door. The caption said, The grieving wife doesn't look too grieved. Notice the designer coat while her husband can't walk? The comments were predictably vile. She read 40 of them, with the focused attention of a researcher, cataloging the specific flavor of each insult. Then she opened a new tab, went to the brand page of the coat. A Korean designer, a woman named Park Soyeon whose atelier was in Mapogu and whose work Jalea had been buying for 3 years, and posted from her personal account, which had 890,000 followers of its own. Built steadily over 6 years of soul life, beautiful food, club openings, fashion, and the particular magnetism of a woman who knew exactly who she was in a city that hadn't expected her. The post was a photo she'd taken herself 6 months ago, backstage at one of Park Soyeon's shows. Her and Soyeon, arms around each other, laughing at something off camera. The caption, Supporting Korean designers since before it was your business. At Park Soyeon Atelier, the coat, the trousers, and every other piece I've worn for the last 3 years. Women building in this city deserve our flowers. Go buy something beautiful. 40 minutes. 40 minutes and the post had 60,000 likes. 3 Korean fashion magazines had shared it. And Park Soyeon's website had crashed from traffic. Soul Whispers deleted the clip. Jalea noted this the way she noted most things, quietly, precisely, without celebration, and moved on to the next item on her list. The next item on her list was a man named Park Jin-woo. Park Jin-woo was 44 years old, had a face built for trust and a character built for the opposite, and had been Seekjin's lieutenant for 9 years. He had also, Jalea had learned from the laptop screen and confirmed through 3 weeks of careful listening, been the primary architect of the false stories that had started the rot. He was the one who had told Seekjin that 2 of the other board members were skimming. A lie. He was the one who had planted the seed that Seekjin was losing his edge, becoming soft. Also a lie, and also particularly funny to anyone who knew Seekjin. He was the one who had leveraged the planted doubt to build the coalition that had moved so efficiently on the board restructuring. He was also the one who had, at a dinner 4 days after the accident, made a toast. She hadn't been there, but she had a contact who was a woman named Song Minji who ran one of Jalea's bars and had been present as a +1 and had texted Jalea afterward with a screenshot of the toast, transcribed verbatim because Minji understood that verbatim mattered. To the next chapter, Park Jin-woo had said, raising a glass. For those of us who knew this day would come. Jalea had read that text in the bath. She'd stayed in the bath for a long time afterward. Hot water, quiet, the particular stillness of a woman deciding something. She decided Park Jin-woo would destroy himself. She was simply going to arrange the conditions. She started wearing color again in week 4. Not loudly. She wasn't performing a recovery. She was simply done with the visual language of grief that everyone had assigned her without asking. On a Wednesday morning, she appeared at the hospital in a rust-colored long jacket over a black turtleneck, tailored trousers with a subtle plaid, and heeled loafers. Her hair was out. A full, glorious natural crown, the kind she usually saved for weekends, because she decided that this Wednesday was going to be the kind of Wednesday that deserved her best hair. The photographers outside the hospital, there were 3 of them now, regular fixtures she'd named in her head. Zoom lens, cigarette, and the young one who looked apologetic, straightened when they saw her. She stopped. This was new. She had been walking past them for 4 weeks with nothing but a slight inclination of the head. The acknowledgement you give a weather phenomenon you cannot prevent. But today she stopped, and she looked at them with the patient, specific attention of a woman who had decided to be interesting. "You've been here every day for a month," she said, in Korean. Perfect. Unaccented. Seoul District Korean. Zoom lens blinked. Cigarette took the cigarette out of his mouth. The young one looked like he wanted to apologize for existing. "I'm going to make a deal with you," she said. "I will give you 1 photo every time I come, that you can use freely. In exchange, you stop with the zoom lenses and the creative angles and the captions that make me look like a woman in a film you've already decided the plot of." She tilted her head slightly. "Are we in agreement?" A pause. "You speak Korean," Cigarette said, with the tone of a man updating a significant amount of internal information. "Fluently," she said. "I have for 2 years. I've read every caption. I understand every comment." She let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. "So, do we have a deal?" They had a deal. From that day forward, the photos of her outside the hospital were, somehow inexplicably against the nature of the genre, dignified. Occasionally even beautiful. The young one, whose name turned out to be Daehoon and who was 23 and had genuine compositional instinct, started treating her arrivals like editorial work. She noticed this and, one afternoon, said so. He nearly fainted. Seoul Whispers reposted one of Daehoon's photos with the caption, "Okay, but the Kwan wife is actually," and then nothing, just the photo and 3 fire emojis. Jalea sent Daehoon a coffee via the hospital cafe and didn't mention it. Madame Kwan, it turned out, was an intelligence operation in a Chanel cardigan. This was not something Jalea had underestimated exactly. She had always known Seekjin's mother was formidable, but the specific form it took in this situation was genuinely impressive. Madame Kwan had, over 4 decades of standing beside her own husband in a world built on similar rules, developed a social network of such thoroughness and precision that it functioned less like a friendship circle and more like a surveillance system with excellent catering. She had lunch with someone every day, bridge club on Tuesdays, a prayer group on Friday mornings that was, Jalea suspected, only nominally about prayer. Her phone produced a steady, low-volume stream of information, who had dinner with whom, who'd been seen at which hotel lobby, whose wife had started wearing new jewelry that didn't match the household income, which boardroom conversation had been overheard by which assistant who mentioned it to which housekeeper who happened to be cousins with Madame Kwan's housekeeper. She would relay all of this to Jalea over tea, in the unhurried manner of a woman reporting mildly interesting weather. "Park Jin-woo bought a new car," she said one afternoon. "German. The large one." Jalea looked up from the document she was reviewing. "He bought it before or after the restructuring? The dealership paperwork is dated 3 days after." Jalea wrote this down. "Also," Madame Kwan continued, refilling her own cup with the unhurried pour of a woman who had never done anything in a rush and saw no reason to start. Han Jung-soo's assistant told his wife's housekeeper that there was a second meeting last week. Not at the office. At a private restaurant in Songbukdong. Who attended? Madame Kwan produced, from the pocket of her cardigan, a folded piece of paper. On it, in small, neat handwriting, were 4 names. Jalea stared at the paper. Then she looked up at Madame Kwan, who was sipping her tea with the expression of a woman who had simply been doing what needed doing. "Iyamianim," Jalea said. "You are genuinely terrifying." Madame Kwan smiled. The small, private smile she shared with no one but family. "My son's wife is being slandered by small men," she said simply. "Did you think I was going to sit and watch?" She visited Seekjin every day, always with intention, always dressed the way she'd have dressed on a normal day, which meant beautifully, specifically, without apology. A slate blue wrap top over high-waisted. Wide legs. A camel cashmere coat that she'd had since London, worn until it had the texture of something loved. A deep burgundy blazer over a cream knit, gold cuffs. Boots with a block heel that she could walk in for hours. She rotated the jewelry deliberately, not ostentatiously, but in the way that said, I know what I'm doing and I dressed this morning for myself, not for your camera. The walks became their ritual. Garden if the weather held. The long corridor on the third floor if it didn't. She'd push the chair and they'd talk. Quietly, carefully, in the register of people for whom privacy has become a discipline. He'd update her on what he was hearing from Kim Boyan, the attorney. She'd update him on what Madame Kwan had gathered and what she herself had observed. Jin was getting loose, she said on a Friday afternoon. November deep now, cold coming off the river. He thinks it's done. That's when people get loose. He made 3 calls to Japan last week, Seekjin said. Boyan's source tracked the numbers. He's moving money, trying to. Pause. He's not as good at it as he thinks he is. She exhaled, breath visible in the cold air. How much longer? 6 weeks. Maybe 8. 8 weeks. She processed this. Fine. 8 weeks I can do. You're sure? She glanced down at the back of his head. The particular shape of him, familiar and beloved. The husband she had chosen and kept choosing every single day. Sitting in a chair he didn't need in a hospital he didn't have to be in. Paying the price for a plan they'd made together in the dark before dawn over cold coffee. Seekjin. I'm Trinidadian. We invented patience. He laughed. A real one, surprised out of him, quickly muffled. You said that last week about something completely different. It applies broadly. The comment section of Soul Whispers had, over 6 weeks, shifted in a direction nobody had predicted. It had started as it always did, the predictable ugliness, the armchair diagnosis of her character, the particular cruelty reserved for women who are beautiful and don't collapse publicly on demand. But something had happened, gradually, the way tides happen. Not one dramatic wave but the slow, persistent rearrangement of the shore. People had started defending her. Not performatively. Not in the viral, collective way of internet pylons in reverse. Just individually. Person by person. Comment by comment. Someone who'd been at a club opening she'd hosted 2 years ago and remembered how she'd handled a staffing crisis with such calm that none of the guests noticed. Someone whose sister had worked for her and said she was the best employer they'd had in Seoul. Someone who pointed out that she had been photographed at that hospital every single day for 6 weeks, in every kind of weather, and that whatever the tabloids wanted to make of it, that was just a fact. A visible, inarguable, daily fact. The narrative was shifting. She could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure, not dramatically but in the quality of the air. She didn't rush it. She didn't push it. She simply kept showing up. It was Madame Kwan's idea to go to the department store. You need a coat? She announced one Saturday morning, appearing in the kitchen of the Hannock at 9 a.m. in a full outfit, her hair set, a look on her face that meant the matter was decided. For winter, that one you've been wearing is good but you need something new. We're going to Galleria. Julia blinked at her over her coffee. Iamianim. We're in the middle of. I know what we're in the middle of. Madame Kwan set her bag on the counter. That is exactly why we're going to Galleria. We're going to have lunch. We're going to buy you a coat. And people are going to see a mother-in-law who has not abandoned her son's wife, and a wife who has not fallen apart. This is information. We are distributing it publicly. Julia stared at her for another moment. Then she put down her coffee and went to get dressed. She wore cream, a thick-ribbed turtleneck, tailored camel trousers, white gold earrings shaped like small bars, her hair pinned loosely with a few pieces falling. Clean, rich, unassailable. The coat she chose at Galleria was a deep forest green, structured, double-breasted, with the kind of lapels that meant business in the most elegant possible register. Madame Kwan watched her try it on, tilted her head, nodded once with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. Yes, she said. That one. It's expensive, Julia said. Madame Kwan looked at her with an expression that suggested she hadn't heard the word expensive used in a sentence unironically in some years. Julia, she said, my son married you. This family will never let you look anything but your best. Not while I'm standing. Jalea turned back to the mirror, looked at herself in the green coat, in the bright department store light, with Seekjan's mother standing behind her like a small, elegant fortress. She thought, they have no idea what they started. She said, I'll take it. The thing about loose men is that they talk. Park Jin-woo, 7 weeks into believing he'd won, made the mistake that men in his position always make eventually. He celebrated. Not at a small, private dinner. Not carefully the way a man with enemies should celebrate. He celebrated at a venue. A good one. A rooftop bar in Yongsan with a guest list of 40 people, all of whom had phones, several of whom had loosening loyalties, and one of whom, this was the specific and beautiful detail, was the silent partner in one of Jalea's venues who had told her about the event, the guest list, and the content of the toasts in real time via text message, while she sat in the Bukshan hammock eating tiak her mother-in-law had made and watching a documentary about oceanography. She read the texts. She read them twice. Then she forwarded them to Kim Boyan with a single line. I think we have enough. Boyan replied 3 minutes later. I've been thinking 8 weeks. I'm revising to 2. Jalea put the phone down, looked at the documentary, something about deep-sea creatures that survive impossible pressure by being built differently than everything else. She thought, yes, exactly. She turned the volume up and finished her tiak. The invitation went out on a Monday. It was elegant. Of course it was elegant. Kim Boyan didn't do anything that wasn't. And Jalea had approved every word of the copy before it was printed on heavy cream cardstock with a single line of gold foil at the top. It read simply, Kwon Seekjan and family request your presence at a private gathering. Venue details to follow. Attendance is expected. Not requested. Not hoped for. Expected. It went to 47 people. Board members. Lieutenants. Business partners. A careful selection of press. Not tabloids, not Soul Whispers and its zoom lenses, but 3 journalists whose work was serious and whose discretion could be trusted to break at exactly the right moment. It went to Park Jin-woo, whose copy was hand-delivered by a courier at 9 a.m. on Monday morning because Jalea had wanted him to have the longest possible time to be afraid of it. She'd watched the tracking notification confirm delivery, set her phone down, poured herself a second coffee, felt nothing in particular except a clean, satisfied calm. The feeling of a door about to open that you've been building toward for 2 months. The gathering was scheduled for Saturday. 5 days. She used all 5 of them. Tuesday she went to the hospital for the last time. She dressed for it specifically. Not the way she dressed for the visits over the past 8 weeks. The careful, devoted wife wardrobe of cashmere and restraint. This time she wore black. A fitted black turtleneck, wide-leg black trousers with a slight sheen, her long black coat with the oversized buttons she'd bought in Paris 3 years ago and saved for occasions that deserved it. Black-heeled boots. The only color was gold, heavy earrings, 2 stacked rings, the watch. Her hair was down, full and natural, the crown of it catching the fluorescent light of the hospital corridor like it was doing it a favor. Daehoon was outside with his camera when she arrived. He straightened, raised it, then paused. Something in her energy today different enough that his instinct fired before his professional habit could override it. She looked at him, nodded once. He took the photo. Later, when it circulated, and it did widely with a speed that felt almost inevitable, it would be called a dozen different things by a dozen different outlets. Striking. Defiant. The image of the season. One blogger, whose taste Jalea privately respected, simply captioned it. She knew something. She did. The room Seekjan was in had been on the 4th floor, east wing, with a window that faced a small courtyard where a single persimmon tree had gone orange and then bare over the course of their 8 weeks. She'd watched that tree through every visit. Something to look at during the conversations that required looking somewhere other than at each other. She'd watched it lose its fruit, lose its leaves, reduce itself to pure structure. Just branches. Just the essential shape of itself, undecorated. She'd thought about that tree more than she'd told anyone. She sat beside him now, not for long 30 minutes, the last legitimate hospital visit, after which the medical narrative would quietly, officially conclude, and they were mostly quiet. There was a particular quality to their silences that had developed over 8 weeks of this. The silences of people who had said the important things and were now simply existing near each other, which is its own kind of language. You ready? She said eventually. He turned his head to look at her fully. No wheelchair angle, no performance, just him in the bed, looking at his wife with the specific expression she'd cataloged over 4 years of marriage as meaning I'm not going to tell you what I'm feeling because you already know. Ask me something harder, he said. She almost smiled. Your mother made galbajim for Saturday. She's been marinating since yesterday. She makes it when she's either very happy or very serious. She's both. He nodded slowly. Outside the window, the bare persimmon tree stood in the gray November courtyard, unadorned, completely itself. Jalea, when this is done, he stopped, started again. I want to take you somewhere, not Seoul, somewhere neither of us has work. Where we can just. Yes, she said before he finished. He blinked. You don't know where I was going to say. Doesn't matter, she said. Yes. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned back to the window. Trinidad, he said quietly. I want to go to Trinidad. I want to meet everyone. I want to see where you grew up. She hadn't expected that. She sat with it. The image of him in San Fernando at her aunt's house, in the noise and color of home, the particular overwhelming hospitality of a Trinidadian family receiving the man their daughter had married. Her mother would cook for 3 days. Her cousins would interrogate him beautifully. He would sit in it all with his particular dignified calm and somehow, she knew, completely win every single one of them over. She felt something move through her chest. Warm and complicated and entirely good. They'll never let you leave, she said. Good, he said. I don't want to. Wednesday and Thursday belonged to logistics. Kim Boyeon worked with the focus of a woman who had been waiting 2 months for this particular week and was not going to waste a second of it. The legal documentation was immaculate. 8 weeks of evidence, gathered through legitimate channels, waterproofed against every challenge, organized into a narrative so clean and damning that Boyeon had described it to Jalea as almost poetic. Almost. Boyeon was not a woman who used poetic fully. The financial forensics alone, the money Park Jinwoo had been moving, the transfers, the new car, the rooftop party, and who'd funded it, constituted a criminal matter independent of the board situation. That particular file had been walked quietly to the right desk by someone whose name Jalea didn't know and didn't ask for. Seokjin's father, it emerged, had contacts she hadn't previously appreciated. A Byoji, who had spent 8 weeks sitting in hospital corridors with his grief carved onto his face, had also apparently spent those weeks making phone calls that had rearranged things significantly. She'd found this out from Madame Kwan, who'd mentioned it over breakfast Thursday morning with the tone of someone relaying completely ordinary information. Your father-in-law, Jalea said carefully, he has been a husband, Madame Kwan said simply, for 41 years. Did you think he didn't know how? Jalea looked at this family she'd married into, this small, formidable unit that had closed ranks around her without fanfare, without making it a production, simply because she was theirs and that was the end of the analysis, and thought, not for the first time, that she had been remarkably lucky in the specific way that isn't luck at all but something you earn without knowing you're earning it. Thank you, she said. Both of you. For all of it. Madame Kwan waved this off with the hand gesture she used for compliments she found excessive. Eat, she said, and pushed the galbajim toward her. Friday she spent alone. Not productively. Not planning. Just alone. In the Buckshin hammock. In the quiet of the place that had been their shelter for 2 months. Walking through each room slowly, looking at things. The way afternoon light hit the inner courtyard. The desk where she'd read legal documents on the floor at midnight. The kitchen where Madame Kwan had made tea and delivered intelligence with equal serenity. The window she'd stood at during the first week when the full weight of what they were doing had pressed down on her in the dark and she'd stood there breathing through it until it passed. She called her mother. Her mother, Mrs. Celestine Baptiste, was 61 years old, lived in San Fernando, had raised Jalea on a specific combination of love and high standards and a very Trinidadian refusal to be impressed by things that didn't deserve it. She also had, as Jalea had inherited, an instinct for the essential thing, the ability to cut through everything peripheral and locate the actual matter at hand. So it's tomorrow, her mother said. Tomorrow. And you good. Jalea looked out at the hammock courtyard, the small stone path, the winter bear plum tree, the gray Saturday sky already arriving in Friday's light. Yeah, Mummy, I'm good. You sound good, her mother said. with the particular approval she reserved for things that actually merited it. You sound like yourself. I've been myself the whole time. I know. That's why I wasn't worried. A pause. The sound of Port of Spain traffic somewhere in the background. Familiar and far away. Your aunties want to know when you're coming home. Soon. We're both coming. A beat. Then her mother made a sound, small, warm, the sound of a woman who'd had a specific hope for 4 years and was hearing it confirmed in a specific way. Both, she repeated. Both, Julia said. Saturday arrived the way important things do, looking exactly like any other day until it didn't. The venue was a private event space in Hanamdong that Seekjan's family had used for decades. A converted mansion with high ceilings and dark wood floors and windows that ran floor to ceiling on the south side, flooding the main room with whatever light the season offered. November offered gray and silver, which turned out to be exactly right. Julia arrived early. Of course she did. She wore deep burgundy. A floor-length dress in heavy silk crepe, long-sleeved, with a wide neckline and a silhouette that was clean and serious and absolutely not playing. A structured black coat over it, open, the green Galleria coat saved for something else. Her jewelry was gold and significant. The large hoops, a cuff on her right wrist, 3 rings, the watch. Her hair, the full natural crown, completely unrestrained, the way she wore it at home, the way she wore it when she was most herself, framed her face like it had opinions. She stood in the center of the main room before anyone arrived and looked at the space. The long table set for 47, the flowers she'd chosen herself, deep burgundy and white, and the specific quality of the afternoon light through the south windows, and let herself feel, just for 60 seconds, the full weight of the 2 months behind her. Then she let it go. Rolled her shoulders, looked at the door. Let's go. They arrived in the way people arrive at events they're not sure how to read, cautiously, reading each other's faces in the entrance for information. She greeted them at the door. Every single one of them. Warm, specific, entirely composed, in perfect Korean. The board members who had voted at speed to strip her husband's authority. The lieutenants who had toasted to his fall. The business partners who had shifted allegiance with the efficiency of men who'd been waiting for an excuse. She smiled at all of them. Park Jin-woo arrived 20 minutes in. He dressed well. He always dressed well. It was one of his habits that she'd found grimly impressive. He was 52 now. She looked at him squarely. Not 44 as she'd somehow been counting, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was power. He took her hand when she extended it and said all the right things. How are you holding up? You've been so strong, such a difficult time. With the face of a man who believed completely that she was what he'd always assumed her to be. Decorative, devoted, and, crucially, not paying close enough attention. Thank you for coming, she said, in Korean, holding his gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than comfortable. Something moved in his eyes. Small, fast, gone. She smiled and moved to the next guest. Seekjan's parents arrived together, as they always did. A Byoji in a dark suit, Madame Kwan in a structured champagne jacket and black trousers, her hair immaculate. They moved through the room with the unhurried authority of people who had been in rooms like this for 40 years and had never once needed to perform. A Byoji shook hands. Madame Kwan received each greeting with a graciousness so precise it was impossible to tell it contained anything else. At one point she caught Julia's eye across the room. The smallest nod. The private smile. Julia turned back to her conversation. They'd been in the room for 40 minutes. The drinks had circulated. The conversation had settled into the comfortable, slightly too loud register of gatherings where people are performing relaxation they don't feel. The 3 journalists were positioned where Julia had suggested, which was where the sightlines were best. Kim Boyan was standing near the far wall, by the windows in a charcoal suit, holding a glass of water she hadn't touched, watching the room with the focused attention of someone conducting the final check of a very intricate piece of machinery. She caught Julia's eye, tapped her watch once. Julia set down her glass. She walked to the front of the room. Not the head of the table, the actual front, where the south windows made a wall of light behind her, and she didn't tap anything for attention or clear her throat. She simply stood there, and the room quieted around her the way rooms quiet when something is about to change. Thank you all for coming, she said. Clear voice, unhurried. I know the invitation was brief, but this is a brief kind of gathering. She let her gaze move through the room. Not performing the scan, actually doing it, landing on specific faces, watching what happened when she did. 8 weeks ago, my husband had a serious accident. Most of you sent flowers. Several of you called. All of you, in one way or another, responded to the news the way people respond. When a significant person falls. Another pause. I appreciated the flowers. Silence. What I appreciated less, she said in the same unhurried tone, was the board resolution of November 4th, the financial restructuring of November 9th, the dinner in Songbukdong on November 14th, and the rooftop party. She turned her eyes with great specific intention to Park Jin-woo. On November 21st, where a toast was made that I have, for the last 3 weeks, had completely memorized. The room had stopped breathing. Park Jin-woo's face had done something complicated and was still doing it. My husband wants to say something, Julia said, and stepped to the side. The door at the east end of the room opened, and Kwon Seokjin walked through it. Not rolled, not assisted. Walked. In a dark navy suit she'd chosen with him on Wednesday, the fit of it precise, the white shirt open one button at the collar. No tie, because he'd never liked ties and 8 weeks of hospital-adjacent theater hadn't changed his taste. He walked with his own stride, the particular one she'd watched cross 100 rooms, the one that had made a room in Gangnam go quiet 7 years ago. Unhurried, settled, certain. The sound that went through the room was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. It was the sound of a reality restructuring, of a story that had been written in one direction suddenly and irrevocably writing itself differently. He walked to where Julia stood, stopped beside her, looked at her first, before anyone else in the room, before the board members and the journalists and the man whose face was now doing something irreversible. He looked at his wife. You look incredible, he said quietly. You're standing, she said. I've been standing. I know. She straightened his lapel an inch that didn't need adjusting because she wanted to, because they were in public and she was doing it anyway. Go ahead. He turned to face the room. He spoke for 11 minutes. She told him not to go longer and he hadn't. Seokjin at his best was never verbose. He had the particular intelligence that understood brevity as a form of respect, and the particular authority that didn't need volume to land. He spoke about the accident that wasn't one. He spoke about the 8 weeks and what they'd revealed. He named names, 3 of them specifically, clearly, with the evidence referenced precisely enough that the 3 journalists were writing quickly. He spoke about the board resolution and what would happen to it. He spoke about Park Jin-woo who had, in the past 4 minutes, aged visibly. He did not raise his voice once. When he finished there was a silence that lasted long enough to have texture. Then Park Jin-woo stood up. She'd wondered if he would. He had the particular pride of a man who cannot help performing even when the performance has nowhere to go. He started to say something. She caught the first 2 words, which were you can't. And then Kim Boyeon stepped forward from her position at the window, set her untouched glass of water down on the table, and placed a document in front of him. He looked at it, sat back down. Boyeon returned to her position, picked up her water, finally drank some. The room dissolved the way rooms do when the structure holding a fiction collapses, fast, and in several directions at once. Some people left immediately, including 2 board members whose exits had the quality of genuine shame, which Julia found unexpectedly she had some feeling about. A few stayed, the people who had sent real concern and not performed it, the ones whose messages she'd read and placed in a different internal category, the ones who would form the nucleus of what came next. Seokjin's father crossed the room and took his son's hand. No words, just the grip and then a Byoji's face. The carved grief of 8 weeks releasing all at once, briefly, before he composed himself, because he was not a man, who came undone in public. Seokjin kept his father's hand for a long moment. Madame Kwon appeared beside Julia, did not say anything, simply stood there, close enough that their arms touched, which was everything. Later, much later, after the journalists had left and the room had cleared and Boyeon had packed her documents and gone and a Byoji had taken Madame Kwon home, they were alone in the emptied venue, the 2 of them, the long table still set with its burgundy flowers and half-empty glasses. Seokjin had his phone out. He was looking at something on the screen with an expression she'd learned meant he was about to do something slightly ridiculous that he'd thought about more carefully than he'd admit. What are you doing? She said. He pressed play. Music came out of the phone speaker, not great quality, tinny in the empty room. She recognized it in 2 seconds. A song she'd put on one rainy Sunday 3 years ago, doing nothing in the penthouse kitchen, and started dancing to unself-consciously, not knowing he was watching from the doorway. He'd never mentioned it. She'd never known he'd seen it. But she recognized from the first note what he was doing. She looked at him. He was already moving. Not elaborately, not performing it, just with the easy, unhurried joy of a man who had been still for 8 weeks and was now himself again in every direction. He held out his hand. She looked at the hand, at the empty room, at her husband, standing on his own 2 feet, in the venue where everything had just cracked open and rearranged into something better. She took his hand. They danced in the empty room with the burgundy flowers and the gray soul light coming through the south windows and nobody watching, which was the only audience that had ever actually counted. 3 months later, a photo circulated online that nobody quite tracked to its origin. It showed Kwon Seokjin on a beach, not Seoul, somewhere warmer, somewhere with that specific quality of Caribbean light that is different from any other light on earth. He was barefoot. He had his shoes in one hand. He was laughing at something off camera with the complete, uncurated laugh of a man who has set something down and not picked it back up. The comments section lost its mind trying to determine the location. Julia's account posted the same day a single photo. Her own feet in the sand. Next to his, the sea beyond them impossibly blue. No caption. Just a small gold sun emoji. Her mother had commented first, "Welcome home, baby," with the flag of Trinidad and Tobago. It had 40,000 likes before midnight. Soul Whispers reposted it. The caption said, "Okay, we were wrong about her. We were completely wrong." Julia never responded. She was at her aunt's kitchen table eating the best food she'd had in 3 years, listening to her husband attempt Trinidadian dialect with her cousins, failing spectacularly, and laughing so hard she had to put her fork down. Kwon Seokjin, it turned out, could not do a Trinidadian accent to save his life. He kept trying anyway. She let him.
Hello, besties. In this story, we learned that not everyone clapping for you when you rise will cry for you when you fall. Some of them plan the fall. Guard your peace, guard your circle. The people who love you will stay through the performance. The ones who don't will reveal themselves the moment they think you are finished. Thank you so much for watching. Kindly like, subscribe, and share.